I've now started this video about 4 times trying to find the right words to express not just how I'm feeling, but how to be of support and of service to others who I know are struggling. Unless you've been under a rock, I mean, you know, the events of this past week or even these past few weeks with, you know, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and those are just the names that we know of. But the reality is that it's hard to even find the words, like I said, but we are definitely impacted in some powerful ways. And I think it's hard when you're straddling a couple of different communities, because obviously I'm an African-American woman and therapist, but I'm also part of the infertility community, of which, you know, these issues of racial injustice don't necessarily get talked about as much. And, you know, in some ways when I'm hearing or, you know, seeing posts about infertility trauma and, you know, and something, you know, we know that it is a very, the diagnosis in and of itself is traumatic, and the ways that it impacts our bodies, how it makes us feel about ourselves and all of that. It just, you know, I just realized what's also missing from the conversation is the layer of racial trauma that some of us have to deal with along the fertility journey, and the weight that goes along with managing your reproductive health in a society or community that doesn't always see you, or the injustices that you have to endure. And I feel like what the video is showing is what a lot of us have talked about for years, but now we're just kind of getting believed. And, you know, and I just want to say to, you know, anyone who's impacted by this, you know, self-care means something a little different right now. I know that, you know, people are finding different ways to exercise their voice, and obviously we're seeing that with the protesting and you know, but there are lots of different ways that I think people are making their voices heard. I know that, you know, I've been speaking in various mental health forums to provide space for people, and, you know, and that is another way that I think, you know, we can help, and that is to provide space for each other and to allow those stories of racial injustices and however they might impact, you know, us and our loved ones and people in this community in a meaningful way. And I think, you know, as I think about how expanding this conversation of infertility and trauma, I think it's important to kind of note a little bit about some of the historical facts about how, you know, just even, you know, medical issues might have been diagnosed differently within the Black community versus our white counterparts, because I think that's significant. You know, it wasn't until 1960 that gynecologists actually believed that Black women could contract endometriosis. At first, it was just considered a white woman's disease. There's a lot of historical narratives about how, you know, obviously the majority of us who are Black in America came here from Africa. We were enslaved, and there are very clear stories about how our bodies were used for experiments and all of that. And I'm sure that you all have also heard of the Tuskegee experiment involving syphilis. And so, you know, just some of those historical stories have, you know, made it difficult for, you know, for a lot of us to access medical services and to trust our medical professionals. And so it's one of the reasons why you might hear us talk so much about how representation matters, you know, because it takes that representation, and it takes people really seeing us and knowing that we're not just an experiment and that we do kind of experience pain in the same way, because believe it or not, there have been studies that show that, or some beliefs that doctors have had where they believe that, you know, Black people don't experience pain in the same way or to as much of a degree. And so, you know, that's built up a lot of hesitance in my community about even accessing medical services, let alone fertility services. And I think that's important to know as we continue to talk about what trauma looks like. And what you're seeing right now in the riots, the protests, that is racial trauma, that is individual trauma, that is collective trauma. And I know that there are lots of other Instagram accounts that, you know, talk about this far better than I do, but I think it's important to loop that back to the infertility world because it is a part of our experiences. I'm processing this with my clients every day as they're gearing up for treatments and trying to, you know, figure out how to have the emotional space around this, you know, because it's not just COVID now that we're dealing with, and the fact that their, you know, partners can't be in the rooms, you know, with certain procedures, and, you know, just so much of those protocols have shifted. You know, now there's the emotional weight of old individual or collective or community narratives about racism and inequality that have now creeped up again and have triggered a vulnerable place that hasn't gotten healed and doesn't get a chance to get healed when these types of injustices continue. So I also want to talk a little bit about ways to cope right now, because I wouldn't be surprised if the majority of us are kind of glued to social media or the, you know, just whatever news outlets you're following, and, you know, really trying to make sure that you take a step back from the constant barrage of images that you're seeing. Please give yourself permission to do that. Also, make sure that you have a safe space to talk about your racial trauma or the intersection of your racial trauma with your infertility trauma, because this is another burden that, you know, that we have to bear. We see the world differently, we're treated differently, or can be. And, you know, so give yourself permission to take a step back and assess what you need. I know that lots of people are also trying to figure out ways to use their voice to enact change, and if you feel compelled to do that and to do that in a safe way, then by all means, but please don't judge yourself if you can't either. The impact of racism on our bodies is powerful. It's incredibly draining. If you're feeling angrier than usual, irritated, or a little hypervigilant, you are having trauma responses. So govern accordingly. Please make sure you're talking with your therapist, getting support around managing that. And I also know that there are quite a few social justice accounts on Instagram and social media that provide support as well around these issues if you're looking for that. I am going to do my best to try to figure out ways to continue to support you as well. And I am actually going to need to take a couple of days off of social media for my own mental health and just to kind of get my bearings. But I will be back, and I will be thinking of you, and just sending hugs and love to everybody who needs it. Take care.